Melbourne's busiest retail season had arrived. The weeks leading up to Christmas, the Boxing Day rush, and the long summer holidays had transformed shopping centers into crowded social hubs. Families moved from store to store with bags in hand. Teenagers gathered in groups, laughing and filming videos. Workers rushed through corridors on lunch breaks, and tourists blended into the crowds, soaking in the energy of the city. Shopping centers weren't just places to buy things anymore. They were meeting points, escape spaces, and part of daily routine. These were places people trusted. Parents felt comfortable letting their children walk a few steps ahead. Retail workers focused on sales targets and customer service. Shoppers expected noise, crowds, and long queues, but not danger. The idea that a simple trip to the mall could turn violent barely crossed anyone's mind. These environments were designed to feel controlled, monitored, and safe. But while the lights were bright and the corridors busy, something darker was quietly taking shape. Behind the festive decorations and promotional music, a wave of crime had begun creeping into Melbourne's major shopping centers. At first, it didn't seem alarming. A rise in shoplifting, a few heated arguments, security stepping in more often than usual. But over time, the incidents became bolder and more aggressive. Theft turned confrontational. Verbal abuse escalated into physical violence. Reports of people carrying knives and other weapons inside malls started surfacing with increasing frequency. Ordinary shopping trips began to feel tense. Parents started holding their children's hands tighter. Retail workers became alert, watching entrances and groups more closely than the shelves. Security guards found themselves overwhelmed, responding to multiple incidents in a single shift. Shoppers who once moved casually through food courts now scanned their surroundings, uneasy but unsure why. Police were paying attention. What initially looked like scattered incidents across different locations began forming a clear pattern. Major shopping centers, some of the busiest in the state, were becoming crime hotspots. These were not late-night street corners or isolated areas. These were public, everyday spaces filled with innocent people. And the crimes weren't just about stolen goods anymore. Violence and weapons had entered the picture. It became clear this was no longer a series of isolated events. This was something larger, more organized, and more dangerous. Authorities realized that if it continued unchecked, the consequences could be severe. Public confidence was slipping. Workers were at risk. Families were beginning to avoid certain centers altogether. This is the story of how Melbourne's major shopping centers became the front line of a growing crime problem, and how authorities were forced to launch a large-scale crackdown to regain control of spaces that were never supposed to feel dangerous. Before we go deeper into how this unfolded, subscribe to Real Crime Saga, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our deep dives into real-life crime stories shaping communities right now. Your support helps us keep telling these stories with clarity and depth, because what happened next would change how Melbourne viewed safety in its most familiar places. And as the crime continued to escalate, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. At first, the rise in crime inside Melbourne's shopping centers was subtle, easy to dismiss, easy to overlook. It began with small changes that didn't immediately set off alarms. Retail workers noticed shoplifting becoming more frequent, but it followed a familiar pattern. Items slipped into bags, shelves left messier than usual. Security called in quietly to escort someone out. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a busy retail environment. But over time, the behavior changed. Shoplifting became bolder. Thieves no longer waited for quiet moments or blind spots. Items were taken openly, sometimes directly in front of staff and customers. When confronted, offenders didn't back down. They shouted, threatened, and in some cases became violent. Staff who once felt confident speaking up began hesitating. Some were told outright to mind their business. Others were shoved aside as offenders walked out without consequence. Groups of youths started loitering for long periods inside shopping centers. They gathered in food courts, near entrances, and around popular stores. At first, it looked like harmless socializing, but tensions quickly surfaced. Rival groups crossed paths. Verbal taunts escalated. Arguments erupted without warning. Security guards were called repeatedly, often arriving too late or in numbers too small to control the situation. Violence soon followed. Fights broke out in public view. Chairs were knocked over. Shoppers froze or scrambled for exits as punches were thrown just meters away. Security guards, trained to de-escalate, found themselves overwhelmed. Many were unarmed, outnumbered, and forced to prioritize damage control over intervention. Their role shifted from prevention to reaction. Then came the most disturbing development. Reports began emerging of people carrying weapons inside shopping centers. Knives tucked into waistbands, machetes concealed under clothing, other improvised weapons brought into places never designed to handle that level of threat. These were not incidents happening late at night, when centers were closed or quiet. They were unfolding in broad daylight, during peak hours, surrounded by families, children, and workers. Food courts became flashpoints. Clothing stores became escape routes. Car parks turned into scenes of panic as people ran for safety. What made these incidents especially frightening was how fast they unfolded. One moment, shoppers were standing in line or browsing shelves. The next, they were sprinting away from shouting, violence, or the threat of weapons. The most alarming part was the randomness. Shoppers weren't involved in disputes. Retail workers weren't targets. They were collateral. People found themselves caught in situations they had nothing to do with, simply because they happened to be nearby. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Store staff locked doors. Customers hid behind counters or inside fitting rooms, waiting for the noise to stop. Shopping centers, once predictable and controlled environments, became unpredictable. The sense of safety people relied on began to erode. Visits were shorter. Awareness was heightened. People scanned crowds instead of storefronts. Workers mentally rehearsed what to do if something went wrong. The idea that violence could erupt at any moment settled into the background of everyday life. And as these incidents multiplied across different locations, it became clear this wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern, one that authorities could no longer ignore. For a long time, much of what was happening inside Melbourne shopping centers remained beneath the surface. Incidents were dealt with quietly. Security intervened. Police attended and left. Life went on. But eventually, the violence became too visible, too severe, and too public to be ignored. Everything changed when a series of high-profile incidents unfolded inside major shopping centers, right in front of shocked shoppers. Violent group fights began breaking out in open areas of malls. Not arguments, not scuffles. Full-scale clashes involving multiple people moving rapidly through food courts, walkways, and store entrances. In some cases, weapons were involved. Machetes appeared in spaces where families were eating lunch just moments earlier. Shouting echoed through corridors. People screamed. Panic spread instantly. Shoppers ran for exits, abandoning bags and purchases. Parents scooped up children and pushed through crowds. Store workers slammed doors shut or pulled customers inside, trying to shield them from what was happening just outside. Within seconds, what had been a normal day at the mall turned into chaos. And this time, it was caught on camera. Videos filmed on phones began circulating online. Footage showed people sprinting through shopping centers, tables overturned, security scrambling, and armed individuals moving through crowds. These weren't rumors or second-hand accounts anymore. The public could see it for themselves. The fear was no longer abstract. It was visual, immediate, and impossible to dismiss. Outrage followed quickly. Parents demanded answers. Retail workers shared their experiences publicly for the first time. Staff spoke about being threatened for asking someone to leave a store, about being spat on, shoved, or followed after shifts, about showing up to work every day unsure of what they might face. Many admitted they no longer felt safe doing their jobs. Security guards echoed the same concerns. They were understaffed, outnumbered, and increasingly placed in dangerous situations without adequate support. Their role had shifted from prevention to survival. The pressure on authorities intensified. Community confidence was collapsing. Shopping centers, once seen as controlled environments, were now associated with fear. People began avoiding certain locations entirely. Others shortened visits or chose quieter hours. The ripple effects were felt everywhere, from retail sales to staff morale. At this point, police knew that normal patrols were no longer enough. Responding after incidents had already occurred wasn't working. By the time officers arrived, the damage was done. Offenders had fled. Shoppers were traumatized. Each new incident reinforced the same reality. Reactive policing could not keep up with the pace or scale of what was happening. This was no longer a series of individual crimes. It was a systemic problem unfolding in some of Melbourne's busiest public spaces. Police recognized that if they didn't intervene forcefully and visibly, the situation would continue to deteriorate. Public safety was at stake. Confidence in everyday spaces was eroding, and the longer it went on, the more emboldened offenders became. A line had been crossed, and that realization marked a turning point. Behind the scenes, plans were already forming. Intelligence was being gathered, hotspots identified, resources reassigned. The response would need to be bigger, stronger, and impossible to ignore, because the next move wouldn't be quiet. It would be a crackdown. When Victoria Police finally moved, they did so with unmistakable intent. This was not a symbolic gesture or a temporary show of force. It was a coordinated, intelligence-driven crackdown designed to reassert control over Melbourne's busiest shopping centers and send a clear message to anyone treating these public spaces as lawless zones. The operation was built on weeks of intelligence gathering. Police had mapped patterns, identified hotspots, and tracked repeat offenders. They knew which centers were most affected, which times posed the greatest risk, and how groups were moving through these spaces. This wasn't about reacting after violence erupted. It was about preventing it before it could take hold. The change was immediate and impossible to miss. Police presence inside shopping centers increased dramatically. Officers were no longer stationed only at entrances or responding after calls came in. They were inside the malls, patrolling corridors, food courts, retail floors, and car parks. Uniformed officers walked in pairs and groups, visible and alert. Protective services officers supported them, working alongside center security teams. Weapons searches became a key part of the operation. Individuals suspected of carrying knives or behaving aggressively were stopped and questioned. Police conducted searches where lawful, removing weapons before they could be used. Those found in possession of knives, machetes, or other prohibited items were arrested on the spot. Others were ordered to leave the premises immediately, breaking up gatherings that showed signs of escalating tension. The approach was firm, consistent, and deliberate. Within days, arrests began to mount. People who had grown comfortable stealing openly or intimidating staff suddenly found themselves facing real consequences. Repeat offenders were identified and taken into custody. Individuals involved in previous violent incidents were intercepted before situations could escalate. Theft, assault, weapon possession, and disorderly behavior were all met with swift enforcement. Within weeks, the numbers told a powerful story. Dozens of offenders were arrested. Weapons were seized before they could be drawn. Hundreds of offenses were recorded across multiple shopping centers. For the first time in months, the momentum had shifted. Instead of offenders controlling the space through fear, police presence dictated behavior. Retail workers noticed the difference almost immediately. Staff reported feeling supported. Security guards no longer felt alone. Shoppers moved more confidently through spaces that had recently felt tense and unpredictable. The visible presence of police changed the atmosphere. Groups that once loitered for hours dispersed quickly. Confrontations were cut short before they could escalate. The message was unmistakable. Shopping centers would no longer be treated as soft targets. They were not neutral ground for violence, intimidation, or weapon carrying. They were public spaces meant for families, workers, and everyday life, and police were prepared to defend them. The crackdown was not about optics. It was about restoring order and drawing a firm line that had been missing for far too long. But while the operation delivered immediate results, it also revealed something deeper. The scale of the response raised uncomfortable questions about how far the situation had already deteriorated. The fact that such an operation was necessary showed just how embedded the problem had become. And as the arrests continued and weapons were pulled from pockets and bags, one thing became increasingly clear. This crackdown was only the beginning. The response from the public was immediate and deeply emotional. For many shoppers, walking into a shopping center and seeing uniformed police patrolling inside the corridors brought an unexpected sense of relief. After months of unease, fear, and uncertainty, the visible presence of officers felt like reassurance. People slowed their steps. Parents loosened their grip on their children's hands. Retail workers stood a little taller behind counters, knowing they were no longer alone. For retail staff, the change was especially significant. Many workers described the crackdown as the first time they truly felt supported. For months, some had endured abuse, threats, and intimidation as part of their daily routine. Asking someone not to steal, requesting calm during an argument, calling security, and hoping help arrived before things turned physical. Now, police were present before incidents escalated. Officers intervened early. Situations that once spiraled out of control were stopped in their tracks. Parents, too, expressed cautious optimism. Some admitted they had avoided certain shopping centers altogether, choosing longer drives or online shopping instead. Others said they had shortened visits, always staying alert, always watching crowds instead of displays. Seeing police patrols brought a sense of control back into environments that had felt unpredictable. For the first time in a while, families felt they could move through these spaces without constant fear. But that relief came with an uncomfortable realization. The heavy police presence was also a stark reminder of how serious the situation had become. What once felt normal now felt fragile. Shopping centers had always been associated with routine and familiarity. Now, the sight of officers conducting searches and questioning individuals inside malls symbolized a loss of innocence in everyday public spaces. For some, it was unsettling. People asked themselves how it had reached this point, how places designed for leisure and commerce had required such forceful intervention. The presence of police was reassuring, but it also highlighted the reality that these spaces had become vulnerable enough to demand it. Public debate quickly followed. Many praised the police action, calling it overdue and necessary. They argued that decisive enforcement was the only way to restore safety and prevent further violence. They pointed to the immediate drop in visible disorder as proof that the crackdown was working. Others raised harder questions. How had crime been allowed to escalate for so long before reaching this stage? Why had early warning signs been missed or underestimated? Were these measures a short-term fix or a lasting solution? Some worried that once the crackdown ended, behavior would revert to what it had been before. Community discussions spread beyond shopping centers. Conversations about youth crime, social responsibility, and public safety resurfaced. Parents talked about supervision. Workers talked about burnout. Communities reflected on the pressures facing young people and the environments that allowed violence to take root. What everyone agreed on was this: something fundamental had shifted. Shopping centers were no longer taken for granted as safe spaces. The crackdown had restored a measure of control, but it had also exposed how quickly normalcy could erode. People were grateful for the police presence, yet aware that safety now required constant vigilance. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere inside malls began to stabilize. But beneath that calm was an unspoken understanding. The community had seen what happens when everyday spaces are neglected, and no one wanted to go back. As the police crackdown continued and orders slowly returned to Melbourne shopping centers, a deeper reality became impossible to ignore. This operation was never just about stolen items, broken store displays, or unruly behavior inside malls. It was a response to something far more complex and far more troubling. Beneath the surface of retail crime lay deeper social fractures. Authorities began to openly acknowledge that what they were confronting was not a shopping center problem, but a broader social issue playing out in highly visible spaces. Youth violence, gang affiliations, easy access to weapons, and a breakdown in social boundaries were converging in places never designed to absorb that level of tension. Shopping centers had become unintended meeting points. Young people gathered there not just to shop, but to socialize, assert identity, and in some cases, confront rival groups. These spaces were neutral ground in theory, but in practice, unresolved disputes followed people wherever they went. Old arguments reignited. Social media conflicts spilled into real life. What started online or on the street often ended in mall corridors, surrounded by innocent bystanders. Conflict zones formed quickly. A chance encounter between rival groups could escalate in seconds. A stare, a comment, a challenge. Arguments ignited and spread through crowds with frightening speed. The presence of weapons made these encounters far more dangerous. Knives and machetes turned impulsive anger into life-threatening situations, leaving no room for de-escalation once violence began. Shopping centers became stages for impulsive violence. Crowds provided anonymity. Noise masked tension. Exits allowed for quick escape. For some, these environments offered both audience and opportunity. The unpredictability of it all made the danger even greater. No warning signs, no clear triggers, just sudden chaos in spaces filled with families, workers, and everyday life. The crackdown addressed the symptoms. Police removed weapons, arrested offenders, disrupted gatherings before they could escalate. These actions were necessary and effective in the short term, but authorities were clear about one thing. Enforcement alone could not fix what was driving the behavior. The causes ran deeper. Youth disengagement, lack of structure, unchecked aggression, social pressures intensified by online influence, gaps in supervision, easy access to weapons. All of these factors contributed to an environment where violence could erupt without warning. Police leaders and community figures acknowledged this openly. They stressed that while immediate action was essential to prevent further harm, long-term solutions would require more than patrols and arrests. Education, community intervention, and early prevention would be critical if the cycle was to be broken. Without addressing the root causes, the risk of violence simply shifting locations remained high. The crackdown was a line drawn in the sand. It restored control where it had been lost. It protected innocent people in the moment, but it also exposed how fragile public safety can become when deeper issues are left unresolved. And as Melbourne reflected on what had happened inside its shopping centers, one question lingered quietly in the background. What happens when the police step back? That question would shape what came next. In the weeks following the crackdown, a noticeable shift began to take place inside Melbourne's major shopping centers. The chaos that had once felt imminent started to ease. Incidents of open theft declined. Violent confrontations became less frequent. The atmosphere, while not completely relaxed, was no longer charged with the same level of tension that had defined the months before. The visible police presence played a major role in this change. Officers continued patrolling inside malls, moving through food courts, retail floors, and car parks. Their presence alone altered behavior. Groups that once lingered for hours dispersed more quickly. Arguments that might have escalated were shut down early. For many shoppers, simply seeing police nearby restored a sense of order that had been missing. Shopping centers gradually resumed normal operations. Stores returned to regular trading hours. Families began visiting again, cautiously at first, but with growing confidence. Retail workers reported fewer confrontations and said they felt safer coming to work. Security teams were better supported, no longer left to manage volatile situations on their own. The everyday rhythm of shopping centers slowly returned, but the calm was different this time. It came with heightened awareness. People were more alert than before. Parents watched crowds more closely. Workers paid attention to body language and group dynamics. Shoppers noticed exits, security desks, and police patrols in ways they never had before. The sense of ease that once defined these spaces had been replaced by vigilance. The fear hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape. Instead of immediate panic, there was cautious watchfulness. A quiet understanding that while the crackdown had worked, the conditions that allowed crime to escalate still existed beneath the surface. Many in the community wondered how long the increased policing would last. Would it be sustained, or would it fade once attention shifted elsewhere? That question loomed large, because the community had seen what happens when enforcement eases too early. Without continued pressure, patterns can return. Offenders adapt. Hotspots shift. The risk isn't always gone, just relocated. Authorities acknowledged this uncertainty. They emphasized that the crackdown marked a turning point, not a conclusion. It demonstrated that decisive action could restore control and protect public spaces. But it also highlighted the need for long-term strategies that go beyond policing alone. Community programs, youth engagement, and prevention efforts would need to follow if lasting change was to occur. For Melbourne, this moment became a pause, a chance to reflect. The city had confronted a problem that many didn't want to believe existed in such familiar spaces. It had responded forcefully, and for now, that response had worked. But the story wasn't over. The crackdown reshaped how people viewed safety in everyday environments. It reminded the community that public spaces require constant protection and attention. Normal life had resumed, but it carried the weight of experience. Melbourne stood at a crossroads. The question was no longer whether action was necessary. It was whether the momentum would be maintained. Because while the crackdown had restored order, the future would determine whether it truly changed the course of what had begun inside those shopping centers. Shopping centers are meant to be among the safest public spaces in any city. They are places woven into daily life, where people run errands, meet friends, work jobs, and spend time with family. They are designed for openness, routine, and familiarity. The idea that these spaces required a major crime crackdown speaks volumes about how quickly safety can erode when warning signs are ignored and deeper issues are left unaddressed. What happened in Melbourne was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly, until it reached a point where it could no longer be contained. Crime crept into everyday spaces, escalated in visibility and violence, and eventually forced authorities to step in with decisive action. The shopping center crackdown became a line drawn between what had been allowed to happen and what could no longer be tolerated. But this story is not just about arrests, patrols, or police operations. It is about how quickly normal life can change. One day, a shopping center is a routine destination. The next, it is a place people enter with caution. It is about retail workers who went from focusing on customer service to prioritizing personal safety. It is about parents who began weighing risks before deciding where to shop. It is about communities realizing that safety is not guaranteed simply because a space feels familiar. It is also about how communities react under pressure. Melbourne's response showed both vulnerability and resilience. Fear spread quickly, but so did demand for action. When the crackdown began, relief followed, but so did reflection. People didn't just ask whether crime had been reduced. They asked how it had been allowed to escalate in the first place. They questioned systems, oversight, and the social conditions that made such violence possible. Most importantly, this story highlights a hard truth. Safety must be actively protected. It cannot be assumed. It cannot be taken for granted. Public spaces require constant attention, early intervention, and a willingness to act before problems spiral out of control. The crackdown restored order, but it also served as a warning about what happens when prevention fails. For Melbourne, this moment was a warning, a response, and a reset. A warning that even the most ordinary places can become vulnerable. A response that showed decisive action can make a difference. And a reset that offered the city a chance to rethink how it protects its communities going forward. Whether this becomes a lasting solution remains to be seen. What is certain is that the events that unfolded inside Melbourne shopping centers have permanently changed how safety is viewed in everyday spaces. And that lesson will not be easily forgotten. Thank you for watching Real Crime Saga. If you value in-depth, grounded storytelling on real-life crime and the impact it has on communities, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and remember, the most important stories are often the ones unfolding right around us.